Welcome back, Exile, to yet another video in Noodle's lore series. This video covers Act 7. Let's begin. As we saw while traveling through the forest in Act 6, the entrance to the previous forest encampment has been barricaded off. Whalem sails us from the Brine King's Reef to the new encampment of Act 7, the Bridge Encampment. This is where Creighton used to live in Act 2. Sin tells us he can sense Malagaro's spirit nearby, like Chevron's in Act 6. We will need to capture Malagaro's spirit to eventually defeat Kitava. In the new encampment, we see Aramir, Helena, and Yena, but two of the previous people are missing. Silk and Groost are no longer in the encampment. Silk seems to have wandered off of his own accord, but Groost has been possessed by a revived god named Wraeclast. After we defeated the beast, a relic covered in Vaal inscriptions washed ashore in the forest encampment. Aramir was able to read them, and they spoke of the Vaal god Wraeclast. The Azmeri, as we touched on in Act 2, are an ancient civilization going back to the time of the Vaal, but also before. The Azmeri had gods they worshipped, as well as recognizing the gods of other peoples. The chieftains of the Azmeri tribes were selected by trial, putting aspiring leaders through a labyrinth filled with beasts and traps, and recognizing the victor as their leader. Fun fact, this Azmeri tradition is what inspired Izaro's labyrinth, which definitely requires its own video to cover. Around 900 BIC being before Imperialis Conceptus, a Vaal ambassador made contact with the Azmeri. For 500 years after this first contact, the Vaal and Azmeri intermingled. This is why there are Vaal ruins in this area, like what we explored at the end of Act 2. The Vaal helped the Azmeri establish a written language and improve their agriculture, where prior to their contact the Azmeri were purely oral tradition and somewhat primitive. However, the Vaal did not share one particular piece of their culture with the Azmeri, the tears of Maji, which we know as virtue gems. According to Trinian, Intellectus Prime, the Azmeri wrote that the Vaal had flesh adorned with glittering crystals. Because of their peaceful history together, the Azmeri welcomed in the survivors of the fall of the Vaal in 400 BIC. The fall of the Vaal occurred during the reign of Queen Azmeri, who also requires her own video. The Vaal had been a large and powerful influence on Wraeclast, with millions of citizens. Of these, only 3,126 Vaal survived to live with the Azmeri. One of the Vaal leaders and gods was named Wraeclast, Master of a Million Faces. Before 900 BIC and the peaceful contact between the two groups, Wraeclast and his Vaal followers had enslaved many Azmeri. Wraeclast was the leader of a Vaal city, but he desired to expand his power through rule and control of more people. Wraeclast desired to utilize the base animal instincts of men to rule them. Wraeclast has sought out Groost, the somewhat brutish leader of the Azmeri from the forest encampment, and is using Groost to begin his reign anew from the barricaded forest encampment. Wraeclast was able to transfer his spirit from the Vaal inscription to Groost. Now we must find and kill Groost to defeat Wraeclast. In Groost's absence, Helena has taken over as leader. Helena tells us that when Silk and Groost disappeared, she began investigating their disappearances. And during her investigation in the Phrecian ruins, she learned of a map that Malagaro had created that could retain Malagaro's spirit. Apparently this map was created before the Purity Rebellion, and when High Templar Vaal learned of its existence, he attempted to destroy it. When he could not, he hid it deep within the Phrecian Cathedral, which is now the Phrecian ruins. When we leave the Bridge Encampment, we end up at the crossroads. We travel to the Phrecian ruins to find the map Malagaro forged. We find a secret staircase hidden within a sarcophagus in the crypt, which leads to a second level. In this level, we find Malagaro's map hidden away. In Act 2, we notice that the center of the Chamber of Sins has a reverie device, where we first learn about the existence of maps from the writings of Malachi. So we travel north back to the Chamber of Sins, Malagaro's old laboratory, and find none other than Silk waiting for us by the map device. Silk has wandered by choice to the Chamber of Sins and tells us that he has a daunting task before him, the last in his great journey. We must kill the Black Death, one of Malagaro's spiders from before the Cataclysm, like the Weaver in Act 2. Silk wants the black venom only the Black Death can create, but seems oddly sympathetic to the Black Death, describing it as a beauteous 8-leg, twisted grotesque by the master of these loathsome halls, referring to Malagaro and the Chamber of Sins. To get to Black Death, we must use the Reverie device to enter Malagaro's Sanctum, the map we found in the crypt. Malagaro's Sanctum is our first encounter with a map. The Reverie device opens up 6 portals for us to enter into this new vision of Nightmare. Helena said this map allowed Malagaro to transfer his spirit to another form of existence, an existential safe house to which he could retreat should death ever attempt to take him. The map itself is open and swamp-like, filled with spider creatures. In the corner of the map, we find a door to Malagaro's workshop, where we can presume Malagaro's spirit resides. Inside, Malagaro himself greets us. As we fight, he raises the Black Death spider that we seek, and Fidelitas, or Fidelitas, from Act 2. Fun fact, you can actually find and kill the Black Death in Act 2 in the Chamber of Sins on the first level. Upon defeating all 3 spirits, Malagaro's spirit is captured, and we can take the Black Venom. In Act 2, we had to create the Black Elixir from the Baleful Gem and Venom from one of Malagaro's spiders, which we received from Malagaro's spike dropped by the Weaver. Now we have Black Venom in its pure form. We return and give Silk this Black Venom. Silk tells us that his queen will reward us with honor and mercy when she rises up and claims what's hers. Silk wants to give this Black Venom to his queen as a wedding gift, and invites us to his wedding feast. Silk's sympathy towards the Black Death now makes more sense. Silk is not possessed by a god, but he has been influenced by one. Silk believes he will marry the spider goddess Akali, another Vaal god, come back to life. For now, as a reward, Silk gives us a key to the Den, an underground path that will allow us to enter Groost's barricade and defeat him. We can now go into the lower level of the Chamber of Sins and make our way underground, towards Wraeclast and Groost. We end up in the Ashen Fields, which was previously the Old Fields, but now with more fire. We can now enter the Forest Encampment. It has been revamped into a fortress, almost like an arena. In the middle stands a giant totem covered in faces. Wraeclast is known as the god of many faces, so we can presume this is some shrine or embodiment of Wraeclast. We are ambushed by many people, then some enraged beasts, and finally Groost himself jumps down from the fortress wall as Lord of the Forest. Once we defeat him, Sin takes Wraeclast's essence, which destroys the faces on the totem. We can now use Wraeclast's power in our pantheon, and travel on to the Northern Forest. There is clearly a lot of Vaal influence in these Azmeri lands, as the Northern Forest in Act 2 took us to the caverns where we explored underground Vaal ruins. Now we can explore east and find a different ancient Vaal city. Before we continue there is another minor god that has been awoken from the death of the beast who is not a Vaal god. In the Dread Thicket has risen Gruthkul, Mother of Despair. Gruthkul is considered an other god, not given specific descent, although she is likely an Azmeri god. Her history is intertwined with that of Akali. Gruthkul was the leader of a tribe near the mountains of the Azmeri range. Akali was the leader of a Vaal city. When Akali became a god, which will be discussed later in more detail, she was able to see visions of the future and past. In one of these visions, she saw the children of Gruthkul ruling over Akali's people and land, their long white hair fluttering in the winds of victory. Akali took preemptive action and began killing Gruthkul's children one by one. Gruthkul, in response, led her people to attack Akali's with all their strength. They brought Akali's empire to the brink of ruination. So in a desperate bid, Akali pretended to be grievously injured and fled into a cavern. Gruthkul was tricked by this and followed. Inside the cavern, Akali wrapped Gruthkul in silk. Did I mention Akali is a giant spider? Yeah, she's a giant spider goddess. And buried Gruthkul with stones in the cavern. This cavern is where we find Gruthkul. While Akali rebuilt her empire, Gruthkul began her own ascent to godliness, becoming the antlered creature driven by rage and grief that we find today. Gruthkul grew powerful, escaped from the cavern, and began destroying Akali's empire once again. This time, in the face of famine, disease, and death, Akali's people abandoned her, leaving her tied up in her own temple to face Gruthkul. After defeating Akali, people began to worship Gruthkul, but underestimated how powerful and grief-stricken she had become in her new beastly form. Gruthkul killed everything in her path, unable to satiate her desire for revenge. Now we must put Gruthkul to rest. Once we defeat Gruthkul, Sin tells us something Gruthkul never knew. The children Gruthkul so grieves for had been plotting against Akali, intending to take over her lands just as Akali had seen in her visions, something Gruthkul herself would never have done. If Gruthkul's children had not threatened Akali's empire, none of this tragedy would have occurred. Instead, both Gruthkul and Akali met terrible ends, and now they both must meet another. In the Dread Thicket, besides Gruthkul's cavern, we find a bunch of fireflies. Yena has asked us to gather these and meet us in the Vaal city. Traveling across the winding causeway, we end up in this Vaal city, which we now know is where Akali once reigned. Starting in the Dread Thicket and following the path here, we have found written shrines detailing the reign of Akali, Spinner of Shadows. The city we find is giant and sprawling, a maze of ruins. In the center of the ruins, we find Yena standing by the Temple of Decay, the temple where Akali's people tied her up in webs and left her to be killed by Gruthkul. The entrance to the temple is covered in a thick layer of spiderwebs. However, Yena's spirit has guidance. The fireflies we gathered are used to transform Yena into a flaming fox, and she burns down the webs blocking our entrance. I'm not sure if this makes Yena more or less crazy, but it does give credit to the legitimacy of the spirit she listens to and follows. Fun fact, Yena tells us when we first enter Act 7 that her spirit knows Sin, and that Sin is much older than spirit. So likely spirit is something like the minor gods we have been murdering and turning into Pantheon pocket pals. So who is Akali, the spider goddess? We've seen her battles with Gruthkul and how her reign ended, but Akali has a very interesting history. Sin's introduction to Akali is interesting summation. Vaal legends say she crawled up from the blackest of pits during the creation of the world. No, her beginnings were far more mundane. A mortal harlot whose endless lust for loin and lecherous delight saw her transformed into the very image of her dark desires. Akali did lead a Vaal city before her transformation into a god. She had an insatiable lust and was seen as a deity of love and fertility. The temple we are in, now named the Temple of Decay, was once erected to worship Akali as the goddess of love. Her worshippers would bring her creatures, mostly venomous, and Akali's favorite was the spider. This is likely where Silk has gotten the idea to give Akali black venom as a present, as venom and spiders are her favorite. As Akali ascended to a god, her form changed from a woman to a giant spider. She could switch between presenting as a human and a spider at will, and would often present as a human to, as Aramir puts it, lure mortals into the act of copulation. She would then transform back into a spider, drain the victim of all fluids, and use their dehydrated corpse as temple decorations. It's pretty hot, honestly. But Akali was wise as well as sexy, and she was able to see visions of the past, present, and future to lead her empire and manipulate those around her. Her admirers expanded past just the Vaal city she commanded. There is even a Vaal queen named Tetzlapokal, who is known to be a devotee of Akali, who ruled the Vaal city that surrounds the Temple of Decay after Akali's demise. Before Sin had created the beast, he was invited to meet with Akali on behalf of a small group of gods in alliance. Arakali's invitation was a trap, and Sin ended up in her love temple for, apparently, years. Sin was trapped as Arakali's slave up until the point that Arakali's own followers betrayed her in the face of Gruthkul's wrath. This paints quite a scene. Sin trapped in a sex dungeon with a sexy spider until the spider gets wrapped up in its own webs by its followers and stamped to death by a giant angry moose beast. It's a pretty wild ride, even for gods. Now, Arakali has risen and she is using her powers of lust and wisdom. We find a love letter, presumably written by Silk, to Arakali, that implies he's been hearing her voice in his head. It says he knows Arakali just wants a man to love her, to break the spell, and that Silk will do everything in his power to raise Arakali to rule Wraeclast together. Clearly, Arakali's ability to manipulate and deceive is very strong. Silk waits for us in the heart of the Temple of Decay, and proclaims that we are not simply invited to the wedding feast for him and Arakali, but we are, in fact, the wedding feast. A massive spider rises from the depths of the chamber, and it must be Arakali. The fight begins, with Silk watching on from his perch in the chamber. Halfway through the fight, Arakali climbs up to him, grabs him, and eats him before us. So much for needing a man to complete you. After she dines on our chapless friend, we send her to her rightful end. Arakali falls before us, and we escape from the temple to the Sarn ramparts and Act 8. It's your boy Noodle. Thank you so much for watching. If you are enjoying this series, please consider subscribing, giving it a thumbs up. If you want to know more about the series, there is a playlist in the description, and if you'd like to support this project, think about joining my Patreon. You can vote on new videos, see pictures of my cat, get early access to these videos, and if you have any questions about the lore, feel free to drop in to my stream, twitch.tv/KittenCatNoodle. And until next time, stay sane, Exile.